gives me great pleasure to welcome Carrie Strickland here tonight for our Hyde lecture that's also held in collaboration with the AIA Nebraska. As you know, that this is part of our lecture series called Our Work, Your Work, Designing and Political Engagement. That is the lecture series that explores design and planning as a product of political debate. It seeks discourse on the consequences of our practice and upon the built environment for generations to come. So that's a very brief description of it. We're happy that Carrie can join us. She comes from Portland, Oregon, which one would all know is at the forefront of urban building practices. Carrie Strickland has deeply influenced the development of the city's urban core for the last 16 years. Her work includes adaptive reuse, new construction, corporate headquarters, commercial tenants, improvements, residential towers, all of which have one common denominator. That is a rigorous application of a simple diagram that communicates the design concept of the building from its site response to the last construction detail. She works predominantly in the private realm. Her work confronts the challenge of making high standard of design possible by working with the constraints of tight budgets, fast-paced development, jurisdictional restrictions of zoning codes associated with urban infill projects. She's established an uncompromising design practice within these aggressive constraints while building long-lasting relationships with clients and collaborators. A little bit about her background, very briefly. She earned her Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Cincinnati. She's a registered architect all over the place, it seems, here. I mean, there's a sort of Pacific Northwest slant to it, but also Midwestern as well, if I know my states. But we also get down to Texas, so you can imagine what that is. WPA was founded in 2005 and is now a women business enterprise. She's also served as a visiting professor at Portland State University and University of Oregon. She regularly serves on forum and lecture panels discussing design in the Pacific Northwest and has served on the board of directors for the AIA chapter in Portland. She's also chair of the City of Portland's Development Renewed Review Advisory Committee and is co-founder of Project Cityscope. Without further ado, I should cut it off at that point because she is here to lecture. But I want everybody to join me in welcoming Carrie Strickland tonight. Thank you. I'll keep this.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Did I manage to turn the mic on properly? Okay. I have two mics, so I get to cheat. I get to actually hear it project and for the recording. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. As mentioned, I run Works Progress Architecture, which is headquartered in Portland with a second office in the Los Angeles market. Most of my work is private development, and I'll kind of talk to you today about some case studies of our work and then also kind of the whys behind why it is that we practice the way that we do and how the design process works in the studio. I always really like this quote to start. To create, one must first question everything. I think it says a lot about how we approach design work in our studio, not just kind of taking anything for granted, building code, program, structural methods. We really do pull everything apart at the beginning and see how it comes back together. So we started over the years to call this process, or refer to it as an architectural analog. We first started talking about it like that. It was a little bit of a kind of a rebuttal to a lot of the kind of digital practice and digital fabrication and modeling and form making that was happening, and getting back to what we felt like was a true kind of fundamental form making, structurally based, very simple to understand. But then the other aspect to that is thinking about that in the digital world or in music. Analog is a continuum versus kind of a momentary digital experience, and thinking about architecture as a continuum of how we experience space. Although, a lot of things change in fabrication materials, the one thing that doesn't change is how we are as a person related to a building or a wall or a floor. We're not going to start flying horizontally through spaces to experience curved edges. We're going to experience them as humans have experienced them for a very long time. So understanding that version of analog about a continuum can play a big role. We pull things out like this. Everybody knows kind of what this is. It's typical old train station. There's an analog aspect to this, which is very kind of signal, how it works. There's a physical relationship to what is being communicated. There's a sound to it. There's a kind of a visual aspect of seeing the motion. And you're able to read it, but it's able to express anything that a digital board would be able to express. The other thing that's important about that is that when you're creating work and experiencing buildings, if you can understand it, you can fix it, you can relate to it. I'm a big fan of motorcycles, although I'm not very good at fixing my own motorcycle. I aspire to be. But it's understanding kind of if you can create something that is logical, you can get in, you can manipulate it, and everybody understands what it is. And so that's a big theme throughout our work. So why is that important in architecture or in my practice? And it really is because everything comes down to money. I love this image of Arnold flexing his muscle, which is really just about finances and economics. As mentioned, probably 99% of my work happens in the private development world, which I didn't quite realize at the beginning of starting the practice, but is what I've decided is the hardest place to try to do high design and very serious work. Because most of the conversations you're having are with private development folks that it's all about speed and it's all about how cheap can I make it, how quickly can I get on to the next thing. And so there's a lot of backroom secret design and thought that happens that we never talk to the client about. We only talk about the money. And so as I show a couple of these projects, I'll talk about which ones we never even talked about what the design was going to look like. We only talked about the performa. We got really good at spreadsheets and code analysis and doing our own performa projections on rental income. And so half the time we spend in schematic design is comparing our performa to theirs. And it's a really effective design tool. It's very manipulative, but effective. The other thing that is the big why about we focus on kind of this very simple structure is that this is not my image, but I use this a lot. This idea of when you're building something that's simple enough and durable enough, it can change use over time. It can have one function today. And one of the things that you can talk about in private development is longevity and flexibility that, particularly in office buildings, which we do a lot of, you can anticipate what the user today will need, but none of us have any clue what the work situations and environments are going to be like in 20 years. You can think you do, but you need to be able to provide a structure and a space that's flexible enough to adapt to people changing their minds about whether it's important to bring cars in, whether it's important that we're making things in spaces, or whether it's all virtual. Excuse me. So how does this actually transform and come into the design process? Not like this. The big idea and everyone sitting around and just waiting to see what the architect's going to do or put together or to kind of bring forth. I can't think of a single project that I've ever done that everyone's just sitting there with bated breath waiting to see what we come up with and what creative process we're going to begin. What it really is truly like is more like this, which is a street fight where you're grabbing and clawing and and trying to convince and hold people back so that you can get a little running room. I use this image a lot in the office, particularly when I'm interviewing potential employees that say we run this much more like a bar fight than an office. In the sense that we have each other's backs, but it's messy. This is roll your sleeves up and jump in and give it everything you've got in order to get these things to happen. Along those lines, I grabbed some pictures of, these are pin-up walls in our studio, along the lines of kind of that bar fight and collective push and rush and hurry. Every single one of our projects that we have in the office is up on the wall in the studio. And it's not presentation type material. It's a little bit of that. It's in process stuff. It's in progress renderings. You're trying to figure out a detail at the time. It's all up on the wall. The big benefit of that is that everybody sees what everyone else is doing at all times. I think particularly when the practice of architecture converted to computers, you never really know what someone's working on unless they hit print. And it can be frustrating as a studio director because you don't really know kind of what state things are in until you have a scheduled meeting. And so much to, I don't think all of the staff kind of love this, but every project that's up there, anyone can walk by their project wall at any time. If you see something, I'll grab somebody and say, hey, what the hell is going on over here? I thought we were doing it this way. So it really provides a true kind of impromptu, constant critique of the work. And the end result is that things are developed much faster. The bad ideas, which we all have sometimes, are kind of vetted and thrown to the wayside earlier because we're all communicating it. Our studio is completely open. No one has a private office, and there's music playing all the time, and it's much more like an academic studio where I might yell across the room instead of walk across the room. And there's a lot of chatter going on. We like that kind of all ideas are welcome. There's not a lot of ego involved, which is also really hard to accomplish in a very design-forward firm. But I think you really see that in our work product. So to that end, I'll go through a series of projects. These are some of those conceptual models that we use to communicate primarily to clients. So we'll get a little down the road on a project scheme, and again, that's like the shortcut or the shorthand, a way of communicating an idea. And if the diagram is clear enough, then every decision that you're trying to make on this really fast timeline along the way can always be referenced back to this like simple diagram. You can understand why you can't substitute one thing for another because it doesn't fit with this very simple concept and you need to move forward. So this is the first project that I did after starting the office. It's called Olympic Mills. Is a full city block, multi-story warehouse. And the problem, again, to talk about the performance and economics of this project, is that you had a giant floor plate, that you had perimeter windows all around the exterior, but by the time you got a couple structural bays into the building, it was dark. And so moving forward, the developer was assuming that we were gonna do these storage lockers on the whole interior of the building, and sitting there thinking about it and thought, well, again, running the math and doing the spreadsheet, if you started removing sections of the building, you get light in other places. And so we had to have a meeting where we talked about removing square footage of the building to get more value in the building, which was a challenge. The other kind of great thing about this building was that it was a cereal mill, and up in this building was a concrete frame on one portion and a heavy timber frame in another portion, but it was full of these grain cribs that were these solid 2x4s stacked and nailed in both horizontal and vertical bends that went all the way up the building. So we started removing those and exposing just the primary structural grid. And then we removed whole sections of the building to capture this light. And so now, instead of this really dark space, you get these courtyards that you moved through and around. So it let light in, and it also helped you navigate this very large floor plate. And I'll say this a lot, it always comes back to the money. Arnold's big muscly arm. All of these spaces that wrap the courtyards were the first spaces to lease. They're still, to this day, the ones that turn, like if someone moves out, they're the ones that everybody wants to move into. It's a really unique light experience, and there's a lot of value there. So this project, this is a little bit chronological. B-Side 6 was a contract that we got while Olympic Mills was under construction. And it turned out this was the first ground up building I had worked on in many, many, many years. And it was definitely a challenge. It was on a section of downtown Portland called East Burnside. And in the 60s, I believe, the city had come through and widened Burnside. There was a lot of historic buildings in place already, so instead of demolishing buildings, they went through and they carved out the ground floor of a lot of these structures. And so now you come down to East Burnside, and there are all these buildings that are existing with these historic kind of arcaded situations where you'll pass through part of the building as part of the public right-of-way. The other thing that was happening at the time was that a lot of the old warehouses in the east side of Portland were being renovated. This happens to be a view of one of the spaces in the Olympic Mills before we renovated it. So the developers on that project were really hoping to kind of recreate some of that nostalgic vibe in a new structure. So we brought out, this was our first design meeting. We just didn't do anything else. We just sat here with Corb's frame and we said, this could be your entire building. It could be your floor, your structure, your finish. You really don't need anything else. And that was one of the meetings that they just said, huh? And it's like, okay, we'll show you next time in a spreadsheet, which is what we did. The site was really tiny. It was only 3,800 square feet, so it's 38 feet deep by 100 feet long. But it was in this arcades district. So in order to make that performa and those numbers work better, we figured that we needed to add more space to the building, even though we didn't have more site. So this is our concept of, you see here, there's the kind of a glass and a solid skin. And what we decided to do was then stretch this one of the skins out over the public right-of-way. And this is the result. So it's a 7-story, tiny footprint building. Everything that you see kind of out on that front face, those rectangles, are out in the public right-of-way by 9 feet. So you walk under those blocks on the public sidewalk. When they're all added together, it creates a kind of 100% pedestrian protection, which is how we sold it to the Design Commission. It rains a lot in Portland. No one gets rained on under this building. My office was in this building for 8 years. After it finished, we were the first tenants. It opened right in the recession, so we were just like, we still believe we're gonna move in. But in this image, you can see that relationship between this glass skin is the property line, that sheer face, then everything else is out. You're in the public realm. And what's really incredible about this is that you can stand out on those like we are in this photo, and your relationship to the street face, your relationship to how you feel in traffic and what you feel like you can own is a very different experience than even buildings that can project out of the sidewalk, but you're facing forward. It's a unique relationship. The interior of this is much like Corb's diagram of just it's completely bare bones, concrete, everything. And that's our projected skin. So this diagram, the plan diagrams on the bottom show like the primary, that ground floor is the property. And then you can see how every floor has just a little bit of space that we stole from the public. to create these little rooms. And most of them, function as conference rooms and kind of extra space, but it's a pretty dynamic building. After that, we continued to work on a lot of adaptive reuse. Again, a lot of warehouses, mass timber. One of the clients we were working with on a big adaptive reuse wanted to build a new building, but asked if we could do it out of heavy timber. And back then, no one had done that, certainly in Portland, built a new mass timber building on purpose. Using timber. Most everything was being adapted and reused, and you're seismically upgrading structures, but no one was starting from scratch. So we're like, why not? We can do that. So this was our concept that we brought to the first meeting. It was just a ship in the bottle. It's the idea of all of those small sticks creating the skeleton that's held within the building. A lot of the historic mass timber buildings, really anywhere, are usually clad in very heavy masonry, either multi-wide thick brick or concrete, and then you've got the timber skeleton in between. Well, if we were going to do this now and we could start with modern materials, you wouldn't ever go out and build a multi-wide brick exterior facade with the timber sticks inside. You'd use this new system that's available called glass. And this is an image of the finished building. You can see in this, this photo is even better at this. You can see the timber, kind of that fine skeleton of the timber inside, and then it's wrapped with a curtain wall that's just pinned to the edge of the laminated decking. The other thing that we did, also all in wood, was to create this heavy base, much like the base that would hold up the ship in the bottle on your display shelf. We created these masses that were faceted that showed entry and storefront, but they were all made out of wood. And they have this definitely a more massive kind of weight to them than that material. The plan is pretty simple. We had some parking in retail and lobby, and then a very, very simple timber grid. This is it going up. And in this building, which you'll see, I'll show you a couple of other mass timber buildings, the mandate was all wood, all the time. Everything in this building is made out of wood. In the West Coast, we're in a seismic zone 4, which is a higher seismic zone. So we have a lot of lateral forces to resist. Which proved to be the biggest challenge here, was how do you deal with big earthquake loads with only using wood. So these are little tricks. The decking that you see is all diagonal, which adds a little strength. All of the plywood walls you see are actually the seismic resisting forces for lateral forces. So it is all day, all wood, all day long. But it has a really nice, very warm effect. All the tenants in this building, nobody added anything. We kept thinking that people were going to come in and add finishes to the floor, but they didn't. This is one of my favorite buildings that we've done. And it was really cost effective. Part of it was finding a contractor that was willing to do it. And convincing them that they had been doing all this. We replace beams all the time in adaptive reuse, and it's the same buckets, it's the same technology that all of those historic structures were using. So we weren't really asking them to do anything different. It was just doing the whole thing. This is the same development client. So after we finished that building, we started looking at a site that was just down the street. It was a very kind of odd shaped site. It was a rectangle with this really sharp curve, intense curve on one side. There are a few other buildings that were similarly sited in Portland and built in the 80s, and so they had said, oh, we can do curved glass, we can do curved facades, and that became kind of this language. And so we were looking at a way to do this kind of heavy structural frame expression without using any curves on a curved site. So this was our concept model that we came to the meeting with, is you've got a stack of essentially wood lumber or tubes, as we started calling them down the road, and you just shift each one back into that to kind of respond to that site without using any curved glass. And then this was a mixed-use project. It was two developers that we teamed up together. One was a residential developer and one was a commercial office developer. And so we went back and forth for a long time about how they would partner together. And this building in the end ended up being 6 floors of residential over 4 floors of office. And so after we set that program, we said, okay, now all of the wood is stacked, you've got it responding to the site. And now on the residential floors, you need a little more separation, a little more ventilation up through the building. And so you start breaking that expression up at a finer grain. So this is the end result, where you can see this is the curved side. All of these kind of stack of wood tubes start to hollow out. They have a lot of play in and out. They stick out over the right-of-way as well. So some are receding, some are projecting. And as you move up the building, the grain of that tube expression becomes a little finer, and that's your residential expression. And then the workspace on the lower floors. It was also on kind of a large site that had the building in the background here is on the historic register. And so there were thoughts on this little tower that you could always see from one of the main streets on the east side. So there were all these moves that we made to pull back, express, highlight, show the tower, even though we were kind of building this massive building in front of it. This is the main lobby. So the lobby of the building is truly mixed use. You come in one side for residential and you come in one side for commercial, but once you get in, there's a mixing chamber and both uses combine. You can see here on the left, we use that tube expression as though you're kind of pushing it back through, and then they show up again on the interior. So anytime they don't complete themselves on the exterior, they show up on the interior. So again, this one took a lot of work to actually get to be built at the end of the day. But again, we kept coming back to this model. We come back to the sticks, the bundle of sticks. It's like, you have to do this. If you break away from that, you've lost the concept. And you lost that idea, and people won't be able to understand the building. People don't like to build buildings that they think people can't understand, so it's a good line. In order to make this really efficient, even though it was 2 very different uses, it's one concrete grid that goes all the way up. It shares the same core. And then on the residential levels, the residential units just fit within the same commercial grid. So there's a lot of kind of play back and forth between below grade parking and the office and the residential program, all being able to respond to the same structural parameters. This is another view of the lobby up on this catwalk looking down to the front door. And then one of the residential units. We left all the concrete exposed and dealt with our sound insulation on the ceiling. And then this is the exterior. So you can see how that first wood block model where we started stacking, and it's a very rigid grid, and then towards the top of the building where the residential units are, it starts to break apart a little bit. And so we took that all the way through the end expression, and you see how it's so loose that it seems like they might get a little kind of topply off the side. But you can do all that in post-tension concrete. It's super easy and cheap. Jupiter Hotel. This is another project that just recently finished up. This was with a hotel operator that was pretty down and dirty. She had bought a motel in the late 90s in the east side when it was still pretty grungy in Portland, and had taken a lot of risk and opened the Jupiter Hotel. She's done pretty well over the years and wanted to expand, primarily because she wanted a big event space, and her existing hotel couldn't do this. So we took a very kind of standard program and kind of distorted it, both in concept and in physical form. So we started with this diagram, which is all your private spaces for your hotel room, the desire for this kind of large congregation space and event space. And then we looked at a very regular building. So this is a traditional hotel. And then you can see once you take that common grid and that tight regular program and you start punching these larger event spaces kind of up, not just on the ground floor, but up in the building, kind of what happens and how it starts to distort a form if you've applied a blanket to it. So then it became the challenge of how do you do that with the material. Again, it's always about money. It's got to be super cost effective. So the first idea that we came up with was this latex. Could we find something that was a building material like latex? We could just wrap it around this thing. It could respond to this force that was coming out. Like my finger sticking through here, stretching it but not breaking it. But what we landed with was asphalt roofing shingles instead. Turns out this ended up being the perfect building material for this. It's pliable, it's really cost effective, it can bend around soft shapes and can work and flash in with really sharp angles. It becomes this really background material on the building so that you really see that distortion. This was the rendering of the building where you can see there's an event space up on the 5th floor that kind of bulges out that corner. You've got the big event space on the ground floor here that stretches and bulges and distorts the building in that way. And then you have the lobby that just lifts the building off the ground. This is kind of, I put this photo in. One of the things when you're designing hotels is that, especially these days, everything has to be the term Instagrammable, which I wasn't familiar when we started this project, what that meant. So since we have this building kind of projecting out and bulging, we put a mirrored faucet, a mirror on the underside. And so people kind of come by and they take pictures, and it does all the marketing for the hotels. Like you drive by and people are like laying down on the sidewalk, and which I wouldn't personally recommend on the east side in Portland. But it creates that kind of exclamation point about what the building is doing in the public right of way. It's a courtyard in the back from above, and you can see the asphalt kind of morphing from vertical to horizontal surface. This is the ground floor lobby and bar. While the exterior facade is doing its morph and bulge, we allowed the ground floor of the building, which is all concrete, to have an expression of its own. We had the stair that comes down, and we wanted it to seem like we carved it and let the stair just drop through. And so that stair is kind of the concrete. We hid all of the HVAC and these soffits that we did a parge coat on, so you walk in and it just really feels like the concrete itself is bulging down under the weight of the event space above. And it creates these kind of illusions of mass and weight that you're interacting with in that space. This is the common connecting stair from the ground floor to the event space. And hotel rooms. The big event space is on the 2nd floor and exits to that courtyard, and then up above, standard hotel rooms. And this is the building built from our drone shot view, where you start to see, again, its relationship to the sidewalk and the distortion that happens as you pushed the gathering spaces in. This is another project that I ran through that is one of our mass timber projects. This was kind of number 2 in the slot. This is a very simple structural grid. It's a long, narrow site. We did a very kind of tight stack of wood block expressions in a very regular grid, and then just smacked it a little bit and imagine that it starts to loosen up, and that's where your kind of ventilation, your operable windows can go. Elevation-wise, again, it's like creating a very simple to understand rectangular grid. But then it has this expression of the smack where they start to loosen. You can see the operators slot in. We used a very simple two-shape metal fin. The building itself is very flat. The waterproofing layer is kind of back at the face. Nothing fancy there. And then we used two different shapes of fin to create kind of an innie and outie relationship that has a lot of shadow play that makes it look like a much more complex building than it is. This is my office now. Our office is in the 811 building. This is the inside of the studio, where you see the difference in this timber building is that we did mass timber, beams, columns, decking, but we did a topping slab of concrete, which helps us not have all of those wood walls. So the building that was all wood all day long. This one has less wood. It uses concrete to drag all of the seismic forces back to the edges. Front entry, still kind of carving out as a play on those upper forms and the triangular picture frames. We use this kind of wood to highlight the front entry and still in a frame. And then just occupy the space. This is our conference room in our office that just hovers underneath the wood frame. Another photo of the exterior. So this is mass timber building number 3 in the series. And so instead of making it easy on ourselves, we decided that every single timber building we were going to do had a different technology and structural approach. It did make a lot of sense on this one though, because the site is a tiny little triangular site. So doing kind of a normal of what you would think would be really efficient grid structure for timber doesn't work that well on a triangular shape. So taking that triangle and using the timber to solve that problem. And so obviously this is the Flatiron building in New York. Our site is exactly the same shape, it's just a very tiny version of that site. So here's our wood block model that we came to the first meeting with about here's how we're going to do this. Here's how we're going to turn a corner. We don't have to curve. We can let the building have this expression of a lacing to turn that sharp angle on all 3 sides. It can be either more acute or less acute. But we'll use that bay to set up the logic of the structure. So this is the end result. We started with this timber grid and then realized that because of the triangular shape and changing directions, that it didn't want to be the decking that we'd been using on our other mass timber, that this project is exactly why you would want to use CLT, because it's a multi-directional structural system. And so it really doesn't care what's going on underneath of it. It'll span and hold up regardless. So we created the frame with all of our normal timber elements and then just overlaid the cross-laminated timber on this structure. This was a rendering during the design process that showed those kind of open laced corners and all the conference rooms in there, and then the kind of the highly regular sides so that you highlight that change in direction at the sharp corners. This was this during construction. So you can see this image on the left, the pretty regular timber grid, and then the CLT panels just overlay in a very kind of one-directional fashion, but as they get to the edges, that kind of cuts the form, and they support those cantilevers. Again, tiny little plan. We did a little backpack core, 2 stairs and bathrooms along the back edge, and then just created a really open, usable space in the rest of the triangle. Some spaces of the building before the tenants went in. And then this is that kind of the photo of the exterior where you really see those corners expressed in the lacing of those tubes. And they're pretty neat spaces to stand out in. You don't, as you go floor to floor, or even when you're standing out there and you can reference back into the space. I wish all of our buildings could be triangles. And actually, we had this realization during the documentation process that it was the only building we'd ever done that we only had 3 elevation sheets. And how much more efficient could we be if all of our buildings only had 3 elevation sheets? This is a little bit of a different project. It's pretty recent, but it was a project that we did down in LA. And this client, we'd never worked with them before, but we had done so much adaptive reuse on these old warehouses, both in Portland and in the Arts District in Los Angeles. He had bought this building and had no idea what to do with it, and was like, oh, you guys do adaptive reuse, help me with this. So this is the building. Not a heavy timber building, not a concrete frame building, not a mass anything. It's a steel building that was built in the late 80s with a thin brick facade and a curtain wall. So I must have visited this building a half dozen times before it really occurred to me what we could do or should do with this to make it a valuable contributor to the creative office world. And so this was the idea. So we would leave the core and guts in place, and then we would just start peeling away parts of that thin facade in areas that would allow us to turn the focus from this, which is a very kind of inward focus. There's no glass on the exterior of this building at the pedestrian level. But by peeling, you can create something else. So this is what we ended up doing. We took the ground plane and we just, like taking a scalpel, and we just peeled the thin brick facade off and replaced it with a glass facade, and then marked new entry points with this other material, which happens to be wood. And it really just drastically changes the perception. There's a lot of foot traffic. This is the only project that I've ever been able to say that I can fly to LAX and walk to my job site meeting and never have to get into a car. It's right at the entry, coming into the airport. People are walking through by all the time, so now suddenly this building has a retail presence and a very different look. And I think it was, it's like, again, a giant floor plate, 40,000 square foot floor plates that then you allowed suddenly much more natural light in. So then, because the building was completely vacant, so then what do you do to this heavy, like everybody understands kind of the heavy timber concrete frame. What do you do when you have this fire rated steel and decking, and it's not what people were thinking of at the time as creative space. So we just whitewashed everything, kind of big paint bomb, and came back in with little elements that kind of hover around in between the existing grid. And I think it turned out pretty well. This is a photo of the lobby where that wood soffit from the exterior kind of entry comes in and folds in and directs you back to the elevator core. I'm gonna try to pick up the pace here. This little project is called Doppelganger. There's a phenomenon in Portland and maybe in other communities where people are dividing residential lots into really skinny lots. We call them skinny houses in Portland. It's a very narrow stack. They're always 3 stories. You have the garage in the front, and your living space is on the second floor, and then bedrooms are up. So we had a site that we were developing ourselves. It was a normal residential lot. Instead of splitting it, we decided to make it really complicated and unwind the residential program around itself in another unit. So we have these, we had to do these diagrams for the building department to show how we were fire rated, the separations between these 2 units, but I think it does a good job of describing the A and the B, and the A and the B, and the A and the B, and understanding how this is one unit and this is another unit, and they really just nestle around each other. So our block model. And then we did 2 different facade materials. One is a smooth face cedar and one is a rough sawn cedar, so it takes the stain a little bit different in the natural light. So it's very subtle, but you start to understand that you see a kind of, that's hence the doppelganger. You're existing when you, out of the corner of your eye, you see kind of the shadow of yourself or the other version of yourself. And so these units wrap around each other and share some common spaces, and then kind of have their own private outdoor spaces as you come up through. And these were sold as condominiums. It's a recent project, big mixed use in an industrial district in Portland. It started out as just a parking garage, and we realized that once you got up a certain height, you had unobstructed views to the city. So we played with the program. We took that office, we lifted it up for parking. And I'll show you this picture. So this is all of the parking below that happens down at that existing industrial area, and then the office above. This is one of those projects that truly did start as just a very basic parking garage. It's long span concrete, and then we did long span steel on the top with great views to the city. And it's really close to the interstate, and you have all these amazing kind of perspectives of it kind of hovering, and you can forget that it's in this industrial district. So I think this is one of the last projects I'll show. This is a project down in the Arts District in LA. I showed this concept image because all of the buildings in the Arts District are these kind of hulking, kind of old concrete timber buildings, a little bit gritty. And so it's like all the pebbles are slightly different sizes. And then we were going to do this very big pebble of a project. And here it is. And so it's in the Arts District in LA is it's the most industrial kind of area that still exists within city limits. You see kind of primary downtown just off in the background. So this project is 1 million square feet. It's a whole bunch of units, 37 stories. It'll be the first tower to be built in the Arts District. It's got an office building at the front that is relating to the existing scale of the neighborhood. And then we push the tower back off of the street face to allow it to exist and still have its own views, but it's not what you experience from the pedestrian realm. It also has this paseo that cuts through. The site is almost 2 acres, so it's quite large. Being able to pass from one primary street to the other without having to go around the block became important. This is the last project. So these are 2 projects in Denver that just finished. Also an industrial district in the Rhino Arts District in Denver. And our idea here, this is Hauser & Wirth in LA. It's a big warehouse that they started kind of cutting apart and putting these art installations in. So we started thinking about the whole Rhino district as this warehouse that we were then going to carve out and put these art pieces in. So our site it's a 14-acre parcel. Phase 1 was going to be the first 6 acres with all the public infrastructure. There was a bunch of existing warehouses on the site, and so we selectively determined which ones had value to save, which ones should come down, and then renovated some of the existing warehouse buildings. We turned them into market halls and created these gathering spaces and plazas. This is an overall rendering of what is phase 1, and I'll talk about this building next. This is a music venue, a big office building, a big public plaza. There's below-grade parking, and a lot of entertainment uses. Mission Ballroom. So the idea behind this is that it's the first ground-up, kind of rock and roll focused music venue to be built with AEG. It's a big national promoter. And the idea was that because we were in this industrial district, that would keep it really simple. It's all this train car stacked program, this kind of stack of lumber expression. And this was our first concept model of understanding how these really large volumes, you start to, you can't add a lot of detail and you'll just lose it based on the scale of the buildings. These simple, large moves, singular projections, singular carves. You have this main venue space and all of the surrounding kind of back of house. And the end result is this kind of, again, stack of these kind of very industrial forms in this industrial district and neighborhood that you start to play with a little bit in translucent with this perforated metal, We used the concrete block that was everywhere on site, but we stacked it differently so it has this kind of sparkle effect on the front entry. This is that kind of in the evening, so you see all of those 3 different materials kind of stacking together. So the interior, the lobby, so you enter this space and it's this timber expression, very tall ceilings, and then you go back through this tunnel experience to get to the main room and kind of underneath the auditorium. It's entry plaza. And this is the main room itself. So there's a big flat floor, about 2,000 people on the floor, VIP balconies that wrap the edges, and then this aspect of these risers that come all the way down to the floor. So you have this kind of carpet of patrons around the performance. Then I end back with this to remind everybody that it's still a fight. Every one of these projects and kind of every project that you'll do, whether in school or professionally, you gotta believe in it. Don't be afraid to get a broken nose or a black eye. That's all I have. I went a little long.
Perfect. Yeah, we have to get you out of here on the hour, but I believe. Those people who want to get their CEUs filled out, there's a piece of paper at the back there. Thank you for waiting to the end of the lecture. Appreciate that. So your name and your number and email. I think we'll have an opportunity to take questions.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions.
If anybody has any questions, but we do have 8 minutes left, so we'll try and keep it concise.
Okay. Thank you for the lecture.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions actually, kind of returning to the subject of the consequences of architecture. The first one is, I don't really know the gentrification situation in Portland, but just looking at your design, like it's really sleek, it's really nice looking. Do you think your design contributes to gentrification or not? And the second question is about the environmental impact of your buildings. I noticed, for example, you really like the use of glass, and like how does that impact how ecologically friendly it is? And yeah, just those 2.
Okay. Now I'll start with the second part first because it's a little easier to answer. I think the idea of kind of glass and glazing, a lot of my projects that are the most glassy are also using tinted or reflective surfaces in balance. Not that it is currently maybe the gold standard, but all of our new buildings are all LEED certified, usually LEED Platinum for even kind of hitting that certification. So it's kind of a balance in the kind of larger direction and expression of building and urban environments to balance with the kind of environmental aspects. But we do pay very close attention to that. I used to show a slide, B-Side 6, which is our first ground-up building. People used to ask how it met Energy Oregon model. We showed this woman in a bikini with a parka. And I'm like, most buildings are like that. There's always something that needs to be covered and insulated, and it's about balance and focusing kind of that glass and focus on how it's going to benefit the end user as well. One aspect is that environmental focus is, it's not two-dimensional, it's not three-dimensional, it's about considering longevity, it's about wellness in the space. So it isn't just about that, kind of the one resource, it's a bigger picture than that. And then the gentrification question it's tough, because Portland, as an example, has definitely struggled over the years, like much longer before I started practicing, with certain communities being pushed out of neighborhoods, I think most of our work in the Central East Side in the industrial district has been around finding ways. There's no residential in that district. It's still kind of a working neighborhood, and recognizing that the different types of work that happens changes over time, and not wanting to push out, the manufacturers or those fabricators that have been in the district for a long time. So I think you have to approach it and you do what you can. And on the other side of our practice is we do a fair amount of affordable housing work and work with community agencies in Portland. And those projects always have a big focus on neighborhood outreach and community outreach and engagement and awareness. So I definitely don't have the solution to this, the larger gentrification question, but what I sometimes say is that, progress is inevitable, and you have to be responsible. You're not gonna solve it with one project or one practice. Okay.
Carrie, great
Yes.
work, outstanding presentation. Your concepts are very elegant, and although they look simple, I know that they went through a thoughtful process to get there. Could you talk to us a little bit more about that design process? Because as you say, time is money, and you're working for a private client. How do you develop those concepts, growing out of the studio culture that you have? And is that a very compressed time frame? How fast do you fail, et cetera?
Yeah. Fail often, fail fast, yes. We do actually talk about that. The failure is part of it. So it does have to happen pretty quickly. And certainly we probably have a bracket of 4 or 5 different major project types that we work in, or scales. So I know for us, we've developed some kind of shorthand ways to get to the kind of the base of the program design. We're rarely starting with the concept. It's a lot of information gathering. We'll do feasibility studies up front. And so you have all of the data points before you start the process. We do a lot of iterative work. So I would say most of our projects, if you look closely, they have the same kind of structural grid, or we know the glazing system we're going to use. And so it's really the last kind of maybe 10%, maybe 15% of the project is where that design concept comes through or comes out. And honestly, most of that stuff is it's like germinating the seed, and we'll hand it off after the seed has already started to kind of pop out of the shell a little bit. So you're handing it off to your project team or the rest of your staff, and they have a good kind of path or framework. We'll even put together a little kind of project brief that has not just the program, but okay, here's the idea. Here's where we're going to run with this. And so much like when we talk about the client and showing them the concept, we're reminding our team kind of what the design goals are in that concept. But it doesn't happen. It happens pretty fast. You get one shot at it.
Carrie, thanks very much. Okay. Carrie's responsibilities include the AIA Gala and handing out prizes later on, right? So I'm afraid that our time is up. But just once again, on behalf of AIA Nebraska, we'd like to thank you, and obviously the College of Architecture.
Yes.
Remember that one. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.